Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli, and I want to do a short video on a very important address that President Putin delivered yesterday to the leaders of the state Duma and the leaders of the political parties in the Duma. As always with Putin, he has fascinating things to say, very revealing, and important in in expressing really what his goals are and how he sees the future of Russia. All the media talk about, oh, what does Putin want, and it's always absurd because, if you want to know what Putin wants, go to the Kremlin website and take a look at his speeches. He's nothing if not explicit and articulate about Russia, Russian history, and I think his own role in Russian history and what's happening today. The place I think he believes it will have in the development of Russian history. So let's take a look. And here I've got the a few choice excerpts from his address. So here was the leadership of the State Duma, and he says the so-called collective West, led by the United States, has been extremely aggressive towards Russia for decades. Our proposals to create a system of equal security in Europe have been rejected. Initiatives for joint work on the problems of missile defense were rejected. Warnings about the unacceptability of NATO expansion, especially at the expense of the former republics of the Soviet Union, are ignored. Even the very idea of Russia's possible integration into the same North Atlantic alliance at the stage of our, as it seemed then, cloudless relations with NATO apparently seemed absurd to its members. So he's repeating here some of the themes that he's addressed in the past, particularly, which is quite interesting, about his proposal to join NATO, which I've always thought was rather an absurdity, because to be a member of NATO, you have to accept NATO integrated military command. That means Russia would have to accept the command of the United States, because NATO is a US-run operation. It's always the supreme allied commander, the military commander of all NATO forces is in America. It's all run by the Americans. So for Russia to join NATO, it would have to subordinate itself to American command. And I don't see how Russia could possibly accept anything like that. So I've always assumed that if Putin made that proposal back in 2000, as he says, then he did it more as a jest and more as a way of testing out America's intent. Remember, Molotov himself, in the aftermath, I think, of Stalin's death, had made the similar proposal that the Soviet Union should join NATO, and then as now, the proposal was rejected. So, and then Putin goes on, and why? Yes, because they simply do not need a country like Russia. That's why. That is why they supported terrorism, separatism in Russia, internal destructive forces, and the, quote, fifth column, unquote, in our country. All of them received and still receive unconditional support from this very collective West. Notice here, still receive unconditional support from this very collective West. So this fifth column is clearly referring to a fifth column that is currently active within Russia, and they're clearly, getting, as he sees it, support from the West. And it says, we are told, we hear today that we started a war in the Donbass in Ukraine. No, the same collective West unleashed it by organizing and supporting an unconstitutional armed coup in Ukraine in 2014, and then encouraging and justifying genocide against people in Donbass. This very collective West is the direct instigator, the culprit of what is happening today. So again, he's making, he's said these things before, but he's kind of making this theme explicit that this war in the Donbass was not started by us. It didn't start on February the 24th. It started back in 2014 when the legal, legitimate government of Ukraine, that of Viktor Yanukovych, was overthrown by the Maidan mob in collaboration with the West. And then that mob, which took power, decided to use force to bring to heel the Russian speakers of the eastern and southeastern Ukraine. And that's the start of the war. All of that was done at the instigation and inspiration of the West. So he's not saying anything he hasn't said before, but nonetheless, it's a very important that this is emphasized, because so many in the West, and I'm not talking not about obviously the usual crowd, the neocons and the Biden administration and so on, but the realists, the so-called realists, the libertarians, the people who are writing in antiwar.com and the American Conservative, all of them still start off with the premise that Russia started this war in the Donbass on February the 24th of this year. Russia launched an unjustified, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. And I think it's very important to emphasize this point. No, this conflict did not start on February the 24th of this year. And then he says, if this same West wanted to provoke a conflict in order to move on to a new stage in the fight against Russia, to a new stage in containing our country, then we can say that it succeeded to a certain extent. And the war is unleashed and sanctions are imposed under normal conditions, it would probably be difficult to do this. And then he continues, but what would you like to pay attention to? They should have understood that they have already lost from the very beginning of our special military operation, because its beginning also means the beginning of a radical breakdown of the American world order. This is the beginning of the transition from liberal globalist American egocentrism to a truly multipolar world, a world based not on selfish rules invented by someone for themselves, behind which there is nothing but the desire for hegemony, not on hypocritical double standards, but on international law, on the true sovereignty of peoples and civilizations, on their will to live their historical destiny, their values and traditions, and build cooperation on the basis of democracy, justice, and equality. And we must understand that this process can no longer be stopped. So notice what he's doing here. He's saying that what we're really fighting for in Ukraine is the establishment of a new global order. I mean, he wouldn't use the term, but that's kind of what he's saying. That the special military operation, because its beginning also means the beginning of a radical breakdown of the American world order. The transition from the liberal globalist American egocentrism to a truly multipolar world. So he's now saying what we're fighting for in Ukraine goes beyond Minsk, the liberation of the Donetsk and Lugansk. It goes beyond security for Russia. It goes beyond defeating Nazism in Ukraine. It goes beyond thwarting NATO expansion. It's all about the creation of a new multipolar world, which will not be based on the so-called rules-based international order that the United States and its Western minions want to impose. It will be based on national sovereignty, international law, UN Charter, and you know the basic mutual respect of one another's sovereignty. So it's really laying down a marker that what we are fighting for is for most of humanity, you know, on behalf of most of humanity, the humanity that doesn't want to live in this US-led, rules-based international order. And then he says, the course of history is inexorable, and the attempts of the collective West to impose its new world order on the world, these attempts are doomed to failure. At the same time, I want to say and emphasize, we have many supporters, including in the United States itself and in Europe, and even more so on other continents and in other countries. And there will be more and more of them. There is no doubt about it. So again, kind of interesting. He's saying that, yeah, okay, you know, we don't have any support among the Western governments. We don't have any support among the Western elites, but we do enjoy support. You know, there are many people who live in the Western countries who nonetheless don't buy into the ideology of, you know, the global liberal order, you know, the rules-based international order. And then he goes on, I repeat, even in countries that are still satellites of the United States, there is growing understanding that the blind obedience of their ruling elites to their overlord, as a rule, does not correspond to their national interests, and most often simply radically contradicts them. With the growth of these sentiments in society, in the end, everyone will have to reckon. Today, these ruling elites are raising the degree of manipulation of public consciousness before our eyes. The ruling classes of Western countries, supranational and globalist in nature, realizing that their policies are increasingly divorced from reality, from common sense, from truth, began to use, frankly, despotic methods. So, well, then there's no question. I mean, again, you know, he's raising the issue that we have raised many times and that more and more people are going to raise, which is that the agenda imposed by the United States, attempted to be enforced by, you know, the United States' loyal sheepdog, the United Kingdom, and the most loyal of loyal NATO satellite states, France and Germany and Italy and the rest, that order clearly doesn't serve the interest of the people who live in the Western world. They are suffering dreadful economic consequences as a result of this sanctions regime. And though that seems to have now, you know, been put at least on the back burner for the time being anyway, they're being pushed into a possible dangerous military confrontation over a matter that is not in, you know, a part of their vital national interest. Never before have the Western countries deemed the borders of Ukraine to be a vital national interest of the West. It's never happened. So, you know, we know it never happened. We know that, you know, when the Soviets sending their tanks into East Berlin in 1953, the Soviets sending their tanks into Hungary in 56, into Czechoslovakia in 68. Each of these occasions, and then of course in 1980, when Poland imposed martial law, at each point, the West said, well, we're not going to destroy ourselves over these matters. I mean, they're not vital to our national interest. America was ready to risk nuclear war over the possibility of the deployment of missiles in Cuba, but they weren't going to take any risks for Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so on. But now suddenly these Western elites have tried to persuade their publics that you know, whoever runs Kiev is somehow a vital national interest of the West, even though this policy is leading to serious impoverishment in Western countries. So, you know, Putin is clearly right here. And then it says the West, which once declared such principles of democracy as freedom of speech, pluralism, respect for other opinions, today is degenerating into the exact opposite, into totalitarianism, includes censorship, closure of the media, arbitrariness against journalists, public figures. This practice of prohibitions extend not only to the information space, but also to politics, culture, education, art, to all spheres of public life in Western countries. Moreover, they impose such a model of totalitarian liberalism, including the notorious culture of abolition, I guess it means the cancel culture, widespread prohibitions they're trying to impose on the whole world. So he's obviously addressing the issue of the cancel culture, which has taken a particularly virulent form in the case of Russia, where they're basically now trying to ban Russian culture altogether, you know, Russian art, Russian literature, Russian music, and you know, to the extent that Russian culture would be studied, will only be studied as an exercise in, in demonstrating the monstrosity of Russian culture. But it's all part of a cancel culture. You know, the cancel culture that bans a sitting president from social media. I mean, it's just amazing that that totalitarian liberalism has no time for a sitting president who had won an election. You know, he's not part of the totalitarian liberal culture. So they ban Donald Trump, they banned, you know, his supporters, and of course then they started extending the ban. Imagine they started banning doctors and scientists who question the COVID dogma, many of whom incidentally are still banned. I mean, although Alex Berenson, as a result of his the settlement of his lawsuit, is now back on Twitter, but many others, you know, Robert Malone and all the rest of them, these are distinguished scientists, they are still banned from social media. And then, of course, you know, we talk about the imprisonment of Julian Assange. So he's saying here something that is, you know, for us is obvious, but we don't say it enough because we live within this bubble, within this liberal culture, that there isn't anything terribly liberal about this. There's not much democracy, not a whole lot of freedom of speech, and we're kind of getting more and more used to the idea. Anyway, but the truth and reality is that the peoples of most countries do not want such a life and such a future, but really strive not for formal decorative, but for substantive, real sovereignty, and are simply tired of kneeling, humiliating themselves in front of those who consider themselves exceptional. Yes, and to the detriment of themselves to serve their interests. Yeah, and I think that's right, and I think he's. It's something that we talked about today a little bit with Peter about the downfall of Boris Johnson, and that Johnson himself rode to power not just on the issue of Brexit, but on the exasperation that the public, not just in the United Kingdom, but in many other countries, the public was really getting sick of elites who made decisions for them, terrible decisions, decisions that harmed them, because these elites fancied themselves to be much more intelligent and much more far-seeing than the public themselves. And they got fed up with it, you know, whether it's Brexit, when, you know, then later on, of course, COVID and the lockdowns and the vaccines, and then you know, war, you know, in Ukraine. It's always the elites think that they know so much better than everyone else, and it's clear that people are fed up with this. They want somebody who will emerge and you know, answer to their interest. And I think that's kind of what Putin is getting at here. I think that it's, you know, that they strive for formal, decorative, but for substantive, real sovereignty. They don't like you know, leaders making decisions for them that harm them and, you know, and are so adverse to their true interests. Anyway, so today, and this is very funny, he says, today we hear that they want to defeat us on the battlefield. Well, what can I say? Let them try. We have already heard a lot that the West wants to fight with us, quote, to the last Ukrainian, unquote. This is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, but it seems that everything is heading towards this. But everyone should know that, by and large, we have not started anything seriously yet. At the same time, we do not refuse peace negotiations, but those who refuse should know that the further, the more difficult it will be for them to negotiate with us. So he's really saying a great deal here, and you know, one should just go through it line by line. So he says, today we hear that they want to defeat us on the battlefield. Yeah, there's been a lot of hot air. You know, as if somehow, oh, Russia's so weak, Russia's so feeble. Look, they can't even defeat Ukraine. You know, they can't really, beat any of the NATO powers. Let's go fight the Russians. Let's go beat them. Let's go. I want to go sock Putin on the jaw. There's been a lot of this kind of ridiculous bluster, and you know, fueled in some ways, as I say again, by some of these stupid non-interventionists, isolationists who are all peddling the nonsense about how weak Russia is. Oh, Russia still hasn't been able to defeat Ukraine, when Russia has only used a very small part of its military resources. And it says, well, let them try. And that's exactly what it says. Yeah, let them try. You want to take us on? Go ahead, do it. You know, Joe, you know, get on the battlefield, put your backpack on, grab a rifle, and come over and fight us if you think we're so weak and you can take us on. And it says, we have already heard a lot that the West wants to fight to the last Ukrainian. Then it says, this is a tragedy for the Ukrainian people, but it seems that everything is heading towards this. Everything is heading towards this. In other words, the West is now inexorably committed to this policy, not of directly fighting Russia. I mean, despite all the talk, yeah, you know, let me go get it. They're not going to do it, but they are ready to send, you know, whatever sophisticated military hardware they've got at their disposal in order, not in order that Ukraine can win. Ukraine can't win, and the people in the West, the military experts in the West, know Ukraine can't win. But what they can do is delay the inevitable. What they can do is to try to hurt Russians as much as possible, kill as many Russians as possible, you know, kill as many Russian women and children as possible. They can just, you know, do as much damage as possible. You know, and essentially just delaying the inevitable. It's a pointless, destructive, cynical policy. But here he's saying, but everyone should know that by and large, we have not started anything seriously yet. And this is very significant because he's essentially saying that, well, we have only used a very limited portion of our resources. We've got an awful lot more in our armory. And we're not talking about nuclear weapons, all this, again, nonsense that the Westerners speculate, you know, Putin might unleash a nuclear war. If he's losing, he might start, you know, lobbing nuclear missiles at the West. Oh my God, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? He's going to lob nuclear missiles. That means it's nuclear war. You know, all that is nonsense. He's not going to lob nuclear missiles, and he doesn't need to, because he hasn't used all the conventional resources that Russia has at its disposal. But he might. You know, it could happen. And you know, if the Western countries do get sucked in and decide that they're ready to take on Putin, then they're gonna get a feel of this. And then he says, at the same time, we do not refuse peace negotiations, but those who refuse should know that the further, the more difficult it will be for them to negotiate with us. So he's making clear, and this is something we've emphasized before, that if Ukraine and its Western sponsors want to continue with the war, then they have to realize that the longer the war goes on, the less they're going to end up with at the end. Because Russia will just keep going and will take more and more of Ukraine because it's essential for their security to do so. They're not going to settle for allowing Zelensky and his gang to stay in power in Kiev and to go on lobbing missiles into the Donbass or even into Crimea and the territory of Russia proper. So they're not going to allow it. So in fact, so he's saying, if you want the war to continue, fine, we can continue, but we're going to take more and more and more. And that means you're going to have to settle at the end with less and less and less. You know, you're just going to have a rump state, a landlocked rump state, whereas if you'd been ready to negotiate earlier, as it seemed they were at the time of the Istanbul talks in late March, then you might have, you know, still ended up with a decent amount of territory. You know, you might still have kept your Black Sea coast. And whereas now, you know, it's looking like you're going to lose all of that. Okay, and that's it. So you can see that this was a very interesting, very illuminating address, and you know, it went on for quite a while because this wasn't just an address, but there were the leaders of the Duma spoke at this meeting, and some of the leaders of the political parties. So Zyuganov, who's the leader of the communists, spoke at length at this meeting. And then Slutsky, Leonid Slutsky, who was the head of the Liberal Democratic Party, which was the creation of the late Vladimir Zhirinovsky. So he spoke at great length. So it's well worth taking a look at the transcript of that meeting. There's a lot of very interesting things came out. And as I say, that just shows where Putin's thinking is right now. And I think that it's clear that the Russians mean to go on and they're not going to settle for anything short of complete victory in Ukraine. And that means regime change, that means removal of Zelensky and his gang in power, and you know, the installation of some kind of a friendly government in Ukraine. You know, I've spoken before. You know, maybe it'll be Medvedchuk, maybe they'll even bring back Yanukovych, but Russia is not going to settle for keeping you know, Zelensky and NATO in Ukraine. Even if, you know, they've taken the Donbass, even if they've you know, liberated Odessa, you know, in addition to Mariupol, Nikolaev, and so on. Even then, as long as the Zelensky gang is in power, Russia will not enjoy security. So I think that's why I think it's an important address. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me, and we'll see you very, very soon. And remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.